Well, my friends, winter has finally come to an end where I live, and it appears the seasons are changing. In fact, it seems that since the cold winds of winter are gone, the season of discovery is upon us. It's time for us to finally embark on a new journey. After having just reached max level in the 20th anniversary release of Classic WoW, it was time for us to try something new and exciting. And I'm not gonna lie, I've been super excited to try out Season of Discovery for a long time now. And with the recent release of Phase 8, a content patch that saw the release of a brand new zone and a Scarlet Crusade themed raid, I figured it was now or never. So guys, let's jump in and see what this game mode has to offer. Our last story together saw us starting out as just a lowly orc, until eventually we made our way up the ranks of the Horde to eventually become one of Azeroth's greatest and sexiest warriors. But now, this story is going to be different. We are going to turn a new leaf. In fact, we're actually going to become the leaf. We're going to become a druid. Meet Fungmans. And not only are we going to put down the sword and take up the shrooms, we are also going to do something I thought I'd never do. We're going to become a member of the Alliance. Now hold on, Hordes, before you just dislike the video and comment things like Deadmans is a traitor and his warrior wasn't even that sexy. Just hear me out. I'll always be a Horde in my heart. I just thought it would be interesting to give things a twist and a different change of pace this time around. So everyone, let's gather around the campfire, we'll share a couple ales, and let's see what the world of Azeroth has in store for Fungmans. Instead of a hellish red landscape that looks very similar to what I would imagine the surface of Mars looks like, when we opened our eyes this time around, we were instead greeted to the sight of a beautiful meadow nestled underneath the sprawling canopies of gigantic trees. At first glance, it was not immediately apparent of any differences between this world and the world of regular Classic WoW we were used to. And our new story started out just like everyone's in WoW. I immediately grabbed the first available quests and started decimating the local wildlife population. But after successfully defeating our first enemy, I noticed I was already halfway to level 2. And within 2 minutes, I had already heard that beautiful sound that everybody loves. And all this was due to the fact that everyone in Season of Discovery is gifted with Discoverer's Delight, 150% boost to XP gains and gold gains. After killing a few more of the surrounding beasts and reaching level 3, I finally stumbled upon the single biggest difference between Season of Discovery and regular Classic WoW: runes. Now, for anyone who was like me and didn't know, runes are essentially icons that contain extremely powerful spells and abilities for your class. Mostly these spells and abilities come from future iterations of World of Warcraft, like in retail. You can then use these runes to augment your certain pieces of gear to become unbelievably powerful. And you can do all of this for the unbelievable price of a single copper per rune. So I quickly saw to it to buy all of the runes that were pertaining to balance and restoration, as I plan on becoming Azeroth's greatest and sexiest boom chicken. Seeing all these spells and abilities made me extremely nostalgic for way back in the days of Wrath of the Lich King, where I used to actually be a druid healer main. Speaking of Wrath of the Lich King, does anyone know for certain if Anniversary Realms are going to progress into Wrath of the Lich King, or are things just going to stop at the Burning Crusade? Please let me know down in the comments, because I would really like to know, because I'm really missing Wrath of the Lich King and I missed my opportunity to play it 2-3 years ago. But back to Fungmans. After purchasing all of my desired runes and gaining some ridiculous power-ups, I was now making extremely quick work of the Starter Zone quests. Guys, these poor boars and imps never stood a chance against the might of my boom chicken. Slowly but surely, as my levels were increasing, so were the amount of new pieces of armor, which then gave me more and more access to these insane abilities. And eventually, we had already reached level 7, and it was time for us to say goodbye to the peaceful meadow of Shadowglen and head west to the cozy village of Dolinar. Upon arriving in the village and speaking to the townsfolk, my services were requested to help rid the forest of some nasty furbolgs who had apparently gone feral and were now becoming an ever-growing threat. And it was here that I ran into my first rare monster in the form of Urasan, a murderous furbold who blocked my path of retrieving a lost tome. And his defeat rewarded me with a sweet new pair of Gnarlpine leggings, which gave a massive upgrade over my starter pair. My furbold killing adventures, however, did not stop there. In fact, only a few minutes later, while exploring the old ruins of Banithil, I came across a fellow prepubescent boom chicken by the name of Boomstrike. And together, we would wreak absolute destruction on this den of bear people. Also, big shout out to Boomstrike for deciding to pass on this chest, as the 4 healing potions inside were a literal lifesaver in the future. Eventually, after we had slayed countless bear boys and putting to rest the troubled spirit of the druid Rageclaw, we gathered the last remaining relics, and it was time for us to say our goodbyes to Boomstrike. And we made our return to the village of Dolinar, where now we were a hardened level 11 adventurer, and we had handed in the last of our quests, which rewarded us with our first green item, the Grit Root Staff. I then quickly finished up the last 2 quests from Dolinar, which, not too surprisingly, involved me killing furbolgs once again. I mean, who would have guessed, right? But with those 2 quests handed in, we were now level 12, with level 13 being just a hair away. This meant it was time for us to say goodbye to the village and head into the Night Elf capital of Darnassus. As a lifelong Horde player, I honestly don't know if I've ever even stepped foot into any Alliance capital city outside of maybe Stormwind. So I was pretty excited to see what Darnassus had in store for me. And after a walk that honestly felt like forever, I had finally arrived. And after passing through a long, arching hallway, the beauty of Darnassus unfolded right in front of me. And while enjoying some sightseeing on my way to the Druid Trainer, I would then learn a move straight out of a mage's playbook. Teleport. With this new teleport in hand, we were instantly zoomed away to the Druid lands of Moonglade, which is essentially a 5-star resort for druids to try and escape from the exhausting world of dealing with all the other classes and their shenanigans. After meandering around Moonglade for a while, I was then tasked with spreading some moon dust on a moonkin stone to apparently summon the spirit of Lunaclaw. Druids really like their moons, apparently. But in order to do so, I would then need to travel to the lands of Darkshore, so this meant it was time for us to venture to the lands of Kalimdor and leave the island of Teldrassil behind. To do so involved jumping on a boat and sailing across the wild, turbulent seas, which, after surviving a strong bout of seasickness, we had finally arrived at the docks of Aberdeen, and it was time to start gathering all of these new quests once again. First on the list of these new quests was to take care of the thick boy Lunaclaw, who came in just absolutely strutting that big chick energy. But unfortunately for him, this balanced druid was all hopped up on Season of Discovery power, and I turned him into a Thanksgiving dinner in no time. I would then go on to begin a massacre on the entire zone of Darkshore, which resulted in me reaching level 17 in like 2 hours. God, guys, I love the XP buffs in Season of Discovery. What would have taken me probably close to 20 hours on my warrior back over on Anniversary has taken me like 6 hours so far in Season of Discovery. And at this point, I was feeling pretty much indestructible. Like nothing could touch me. But WoW was about to serve me up a good helping of humble pie. You see, there I was. I was confidently making my way into this cave that was filled to the absolute brim with Nagas. But I, confidence to the max, paid them no mind. I mean, come on, I'm a freaking boom chicken, guys. What are they gonna do to me? Well, I'll tell you. They killed the hell out of me is what they did. That's right, Fungman's perfect run came to a very anticlimactic finish at the level of 19. And although our ego and pride may have taken a massive hit, we were not going to let this little hurdle prevent us from achieving our glory. However, I would be lying to you if I said that this was going to be our last run-in with death. No sir, because like literally 10 minutes later, I was sent packing to the spirit realm by Yogi Bear and her annoying cubs. 3 frickin' times. That's right, guys. I literally got my butt kicked by this family of porridge-eating monsters over and over. But eventually, I finally got my revenge and I sent these grizzlies to the graveyard. Now, after turning in all of our completed Darkshore quests, we were now level 20. And this meant that it was time. It was time for us to make the most important journey of any young Night Elf's life. It was time for us to finally visit the Eastern Kingdoms, and more specifically, the human kingdom of Stormwind. Now, anyone here that's ever played a Night Elf knows exactly what this journey entails. And slowly but surely, we traveled from dock to dock, boat to boat, crossing the wild open wetlands and eventually arriving in the snowy mountain lands of Dunmoreau, which is home to the dwarves and their capital city of Ironforge. Puffing and puffing from my incredibly long journey, I finally entered the great halls of Ironforge for the first time. And I just have to say, this city's actually pretty cool and interesting. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's no Undercity, but hey, for the Alliance, it's not too shabby. I was also blown away by just how many people were just sitting around on their beautiful mounts and rocking their brand new Scarlet gear. Not gonna lie, the jealousy started flowing out of me like a garden hose. But I decided that this was just the motivation I needed to make sure I made it to the end game and got to experience the full raiding experience that Season of Discovery has to offer. It was then that I also got to experience riding the tram for the first time, which I'll say is a pretty cool means of travel when compared to just sitting on a dock waiting for a slow boat to arrive. And eventually, after the tram had went through its entire track, we had finally arrived, friends. Our feet were tired, and our body was beaten, but we had arrived at the human kingdom of Stormwind. But there was no rest for the wicked because I was not here to sightsee, and I quickly found the city's herbalism and skinning traders because I knew eventually we were going to need a solid means of funding our spending habits. And after unlocking a means of making some quick cash, it was already time to say goodbye to the tall castle walls of Stormwind and head to our next questing zone. And this is a zone that I've been eager to level in since I first started playing World of Warcraft. You see, as a hordie, we never got to experience the creepy and morbid joys of leveling in Duskwood, and it was time for that to change. And honestly, it only took me a good 5 or so minutes from the gates of Stormwind to arrive on the shores of Duskwood. And I was immediately greeted into the zone by the angry fangs of wolves and spiders. This was also going to be the zone that I found myself residing in for the next 10 or so levels. But that was going to have to wait, because I immediately found myself invited into a Deadmines group. It was our first dungeon on the Druid, and I was beyond excited because at these low levels, each upgrade is so incredibly impactful. And we started our adventure into the dungeon by absolutely melting our way through the trash packs on our way to the first boss, Raxor. Raxor the Ogre didn't fare too much differently than the trash. I don't think it was more than 30 seconds and the poor guy was already dead. Unfortunately, he didn't have anything for me as far as items go, so it was on to the next boss, the Goblin Schneed, who was sitting atop his shredder with his little army of goblins. And I may or may not have pulled a few extra mobs with my Starfall ability. This is going to be a recurring thing that you probably see throughout this series. This caused the healer to almost immediately go out of mana on the fight, but thankfully your boy Fungmans isn't afraid to pick up a little healing slack when things get dicey. Eventually we were able to put down the boss and the added mobs. This meant that the next boss up on the list was another goblin by the name of Gildnid. Now this boss had the opportunity to drop a great caster ring by the name of the Lavishly Jeweled Ring. And eventually, after beating him, wouldn't you know it, boys? It actually dropped. This meant we were the proud new owner of our first ring. I mean, we would be if it wasn't for the warrior winning it. I'm not gonna lie, that kind of pissed me off, but it's nothing compared to losing the Savage Gladiator chain to that shaman. Yeah, I'm not over it, alright? I'm not gonna forget about that. Alright, the next bosses, Smite and Cookie, tried and failed to prevent us from reaching the Defias leader Edwin Van Cleef. Their efforts were valiant, but they were fruitless, and eventually we stood toe-to-toe with the outlaw. And what ensued next was a scenery of spells and swords being thrown left and right as you could hear Edwin's shouts for vengeance and revenge.
The Brotherhood shall prevail.
But eventually, the former stonemason's voice faded into the shadows as his body fell before us. And with his defeat, Deadmines, the iconic Alliance dungeon, was completed. Now speaking of iconic, it wasn't but 5 minutes later and I had my first run-in with one of Classic WoW's most iconic NPCs, Stitches. And as I'm sure you can guess, it didn't go so well for me, boys. After getting my ass handed to me by the big undead dummy, I returned back to Stormwind to do a little shopping. First off, it was probably about time to finally put on a pair of pants and stop strutting around in this little loincloth. People were starting to look at me strangely and saying weird things. But it was also time for us to purchase our first pair of shoulders, because nothing in World of Warcraft feels as good as your first helm or your first pair of shoulders. And although yes, they were a crappy pair of gray shoulders that I bought for 50 silver, they still increased my druid drip factor by 1,000. And it wasn't even a couple minutes later that people must have taken notice of my swaggy shoulders, because I was promptly invited to a Black Fathom Depths group, which meant this was going to be our first ever raid. So once again, I quickly scurried down to Menethil Harbor to return back to the lands of Kalimdor, where, once in Aberdeen, I quickly grabbed all the quests I could for the raid, and it was time to set off to Ashenvale. And before long, we were at the entrance to our very first raid. I'm straight up not gonna lie, guys. I was extremely excited, but also very nervous because I didn't really do the right thing. I didn't do any research on the fights, and well, it pretty much showed almost immediately, because this poor little Icarus swam way too close to the boss and wound up dying 2 minutes after entering the raid. I'm very lucky that this is not a hardcore run, or we would have been starting over like 7 times. Thankfully, the entire group was comprised of chill people, and I didn't receive too much flack for my newbie mistakes, and the rest of the raid went off without much of a hitch. Besides me dying again to the same boss and basically being locked out of the raid for like 10 minutes for some unknown reason. What I thought was going to be a horrible run that was cursed by this immediate starting bad luck actually turned out to be an incredibly juicy raid filled with so many goodies. With the first boss down, this meant we had 6 remaining bosses to attend to. First up on the list was Gumra, a giant turtle imbued with the power of bubbles. The fight mechanics were not too complicated outside of basically don't stand next to the bubbles, and although the fight didn't last long, it was already such a cool experience to be in a 10-man setting fighting a giant boss at level 25. The boss didn't really drop anything of use to us, but that was alright. I was just happy to be a part of the group. The next boss up was Lady Cerberus, which I don't even know if she has any mechanics, because she basically died in 30 seconds. But what I do know is she drops an amazing helm for us that we would likely use all the way into the 30s. And wouldn't you know it, boys? We actually won a drop for once. Next up on the list was the Murloc boss, Gilahast, which is actually a pretty interactive boss fight. You have to be very mindful of his little ghost apparitions running around and all of his purple bubble bombs. And after surviving his Twilight-themed torture chamber and putting an end to him, he dropped an absolute banger of a chest upgrade in the form of the Black Boiled Leathers. And wouldn't you know it, boys? This guy actually won the role against 2 other druids. Next up on the list was Lorgus Jet, which to me turned out to be a fairly difficult boss with some very hard-hitting abilities like his lightning totem. Unfortunately, your boy Fungmans did not survive the encounter, but thankfully the raid was able to pump out some good damage and take him down without losing too many more people and too much of a difficulty. He dropped another good caster helm, but it was inferior to the one I had already won previously, and to be honest with you, even if it was better than the one that I had already won, I probably would have passed since I've already won 2 upgrades at this point, and it wouldn't have felt right taking another helm now that this previous one was soulbound. With his defeat, this meant we only had 2 bosses remaining, with the next one dropping an epic staff that would likely stay with us well into the later levels. Twilight Lord Kelrus, a mad orc warlock with heavy-hitting shadow abilities that many consider to be the hardest boss of the entire raid. Although personally, I didn't find him too difficult as we were able to make fairly quick work of him. Unfortunately though, his defeat did not bring forth the epic staff, but at this point, I had already won so many upgrades I didn't even really feel too bad. This meant that it was time to slay the final boss of the dungeon, the giant 3-headed serpent, Akumao, which, for being the final boss of the raid, actually seemed to be fairly easy. In fact, its whole mechanic was basically just don't stand in front of him and you're basically good to go. And with his defeat, we had officially cleared our first raid in Season of Discovery, and we had already reached level 27. We even managed to snag a pair of shoulders that, I'll be honest, although they were more feral focused, were a clear upgrade over our pair of shoddy gray shoulders with no stat increases. So after finishing up our first raid and handing in some quests, I figured this was the perfect stopping point for the night, and I logged off for the night with our druid looking mighty snazzy with this whole new wardrobe of upgrades. It was a new day in Azeroth, and I started off this new day by immediately creating a stockade group to try and finish off a few quests that I had gathered and try and get some quick experience in. And within 5 minutes, the group was already assembled and ready to go. And this was also going to be my first time seeing a Warlock tank in action, and I gotta say, it's actually quite impressive how decent they're able to do as tanks in Season of Discovery. This entire run of stockades only took us about 15 or so minutes and basically got us an entire level and a half when you included all the quests. After getting all those upgrades in the previous night's raid, it was also a night and day difference on how strong I had gotten. I mean, we were able to pump out some serious damage now. These poor level 24 and 25 elites stood no chance against me now. After successfully clearing the stockades, it was time for us to return to the Misty Lands of Duskwood to try and clean up some of the remaining quests. First one being taking care of these darn Worgans who used to bully the hell out of me when I first got into the zone. After doing a little role-playing as Van Helsing and getting some revenge on the werewolves, it was time for us to get revenge on the elite skeletal warrior, Mor Ladem, the wandering undead monstrosity that was responsible for at least 3 of my deaths while questing. Quickly, we joined up with the mage Anbar and the high-level rogue Zachary, who thankfully helped us take down this level 35 elite. And I also helped the boys take out Morbid Fell. And after successfully taking down the Warlock and returning to Darkshire, it was time for us to turn in the quest and finally reach my goal for the episode. That was reaching level 30. We did it. But the episode isn't over yet. We still had to return to Moonglade and get all our beautiful level 30 skills like Travel Form and a bunch of new rank ups. And finally, last but not least, it was time for us to return to Ironforge and hand in the last of the raid quests and get our first ever ring. This meant that not only did we have our first piece of jewelry, but we also gained another rune slot. So my friends, this is where the first leg of Feng Mun's journey will come to an end. But trust me, this is only the beginning. We still have so much to see and so much to accomplish in the Land of Discovery. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on any future episodes, and I want to thank each and every one of you for making it this far. You don't know how much I truly appreciate it. And this is Deadmans, and I'll see you in the next video.